That letter was never meant to change anything. It was just an old envelope I found at the bottom of a wooden box, the kind people keep for things they can't quite throw away. My name is Harold Bennett, and I'm 82 years old. Until the day I found that letter, I believed I understood the story of my own life, but sometimes a single piece of paper can quietly rearrange memories you've carried for decades. I found it on an ordinary afternoon. The house was quiet in the way it often is when you've lived long enough to see it empty out. My wife passed away 6 years ago, and the children have families and lives in other places now. So I spend some of my days going through drawers and boxes that haven't been opened in years, trying to decide what should stay and what should go. That afternoon I was sitting on the floor beside an old cedar chest that used to belong to my wife. It smelled faintly of wood and old paper, the way time itself seems to smell when it's been sitting still for a while. I lifted out photo albums, birthday cards, a few small toys that once belonged to my kids when they were little. At the very bottom was a bundle of letters tied with a thin blue ribbon. Most of them were familiar. Notes my wife had written me when we were young, postcards from relatives, Christmas cards from people whose faces I could still picture if I tried. But tucked between them was an envelope I didn't recognize. My name was written on the front. The handwriting stopped me for a moment, because it stirred something faint in my memory, the way a voice might sound familiar even if you can't place it right away. The envelope was yellowed with age, and the stamp told me it had been mailed sometime in the early 1970s. I opened it carefully, like you do with old paper that might fall apart if you're too quick with it. Inside was a single sheet, and the moment I started reading, I realized the letter had come from someone I hadn't thought about in more than 50 years. Her name was Eleanor. We met when I was 23. Back then I was working at a small machine shop just outside town. I didn't have much to my name except a steady job, and the belief that if I worked hard enough, life would eventually sort itself out. Eleanor worked at the town library. I used to stop there sometimes in the evenings, pretending I needed to return a book when really I just wanted an excuse to talk to her for a few minutes. She had a quiet way about her, not shy exactly, just thoughtful, the kind of person who listened closely before she spoke. We spent a lot of evenings walking around the square after the library closed. Nothing dramatic ever happened during those walks. Mostly we talked about small things, books she liked, places we both hoped to see someday, what kind of lives we imagined for ourselves. At 23, imagining a life feels like standing at the edge of a wide open road. Everything seems possible. For a while I thought Eleanor and I might walk that road together. But life has a way of moving quickly when you're young. Opportunities come along, decisions get made, and before you fully understand what's happening, a chapter closes. A job opened up for me in another city. It paid better than anything I'd ever earned, and at that age the idea of building a future felt urgent. I told myself it was the sensible thing to do. Eleanor and I said goodbye on a cool autumn evening outside the library. I remember she smiled in that quiet way of hers and told me she hoped the new job would bring me everything I wanted. I told her I'd write. For a while I did. A few letters went back and forth during that first year. Nothing dramatic, just small updates about work and life. But as time passed, my responses became slower. Then eventually they stopped altogether. Not because anything terrible had happened, just because life kept moving forward. I met the woman who would later become my wife. We married, raised 2 children, built a good life together. The years filled themselves with work, school events, bills, birthdays, responsibilities. Eleanor slowly faded into the quiet background of memory, the way some people do when enough time passes, until the afternoon I opened that envelope. The letter inside had been written during that first year after I left town. She wrote about how strange it felt walking home from the library without our evening conversations. She said she hoped the new job was treating me well. She mentioned a few ordinary things about her days, but near the end of the letter there was a sentence that made me stop reading for a moment. She wrote that she had waited outside the post office for nearly an hour the week before, hoping a letter from me might arrive. She said she knew I was probably busy building a new life, and she didn't want to be someone who stood in the way of that. But she wanted me to know that the time we spent together had meant more to her than she had ever said out loud. There was no bitterness in the letter, no accusation, just a quiet honesty. The date at the top told me something else I hadn't realized before. She had written that letter months after the last one I sent, which meant she had been waiting for an answer that never came. I sat there on the floor for a long time after reading it, because for more than 50 years, the story I told myself about that part of my life had been very simple. I believed we had both moved on without much thought. I assumed those evenings we spent walking through town had been pleasant, but not particularly important. The letter told a different story. It revealed something I had never stopped long enough to consider. While I was busy rushing toward the future, someone else had been quietly standing still, waiting to hear from me. And the truth is, I never even knew. Memory has a strange way of protecting us. It smooths the edges of old decisions so we can keep moving forward without carrying too much weight. But that letter reminded me that every choice we make leaves a small imprint on someone else's life. Sometimes we never see it. I folded the paper back along its original crease and slipped it into the envelope again. For a while I just held it in my hands, thinking about the young man I used to be. I don't blame him. At 23, most of us are too busy trying to figure out our own path to notice the quiet crossroads we leave behind for others. But reading Eleanor's words all these years later made me realize something I hadn't understood before. The past is not only made of the things we remember, it's also made of the moments we never fully saw at the time. I never learned what became of her. Life carried me in one direction, and hers carried her somewhere else. That's the way most stories go. But finding that letter changed something inside the way I look back on my life. It reminded me that the smallest kindness, the simplest reply, the briefest acknowledgement of another person's heart can matter far more than we realize in the moment. And sometimes the things we leave unsaid echo much longer than the words we do speak. So if you're listening to an old man tonight, let me tell you this. When someone reaches out to you with sincerity, don't assume there will always be time to answer later, because one day, many years from now, you might open a drawer, unfold a quiet piece of paper, and realize that a moment you barely noticed once meant the world to someone else.